hero of the rails. It was summer on Sodor. The skies were bright blue, and the fields were full of flowers, whilst the birds sang a sweet chorus. As Thomas filled up with water, he felt very happy. Suddenly, there was a whoosh and a wheesh and a clackety-clack as a streak of silver thundered by. All over Sodor, Thomas's friends were buffeted and blasted on their track. Later, Thomas and the others were at Knapford. They were very puzzled, and Spencer steamed smugly away. That afternoon, Thomas and Percy were going up Gordon's Hill. Then they heard Spencer wheeshing up alongside them. Next, he caught up with Gordon. Toby was at a junction with some log trucks. Spencer came up alongside, whistling rudely at him. Toby gasped. He was upset having missed his road. Then it was Edward and James's turn to meet with Spencer. And Spencer thundered away. James was so cross that he couldn't puff at all. That night, the engines could only talk about Spencer. The next morning, Thomas was at Brendam Docks, being coupled to a heavy flatbed of machinery. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only one there. Spencer was being coupled up to 5 flatbeds of building materials. This made the engines very cross. This time, Spencer had gone too far. But the Sodor engines didn't scare Spencer. An idea had bubbled in his boiler, and Spencer slid slyly out of the docks. All of a sudden, Thomas didn't feel so strong. The other engines saw the worry on their friend's face. Thomas looked at Percy. This brought his confidence back. The light of dawn wrapped a cold finger around the shunting yards as Thomas waited for his competitor. They could see a streak of silver steaming towards them. Sure enough, it was Spencer. Worry fell over the little tank engine once more. The tracks were cleared for both engines as Thomas and Spencer coupled up to their heavy loads. Edward puffed forward. Then Edward whistled long and hard. The contest was on. Both Spencer and Thomas pumped their pistons. Thomas puffed off with a heave and a huff. Spencer smiled as he slid away. The other engines watched in anxious anticipation. Then they blew their whistles long and strong. Thomas and Spencer raced around the island, clickety-clacking along the tracks, whooshing through woods and hurried up hills. Spencer steamed smugly as he moved without effort. With every passing mile, Thomas felt the long load behind him getting heavier, but he surged on. Thomas was huffing up a steep slope. Puffing and panting, his axles started to ache. At last, he reached the top. Then there was trouble. A clang and a prang was heard on his undercarriage. He let out a gasp. Thomas's wheels started to wobble and whirl. He flew faster and faster down the hill. Thomas raced down one hill and rattled up the next. His heavy trucks pushed him on and on, through a junction where Spencer was waiting, and right into some potato trucks, causing them to bounce everywhere. But Thomas sped on, into a flatbed of jam barrels. Sticky jam flew into the air and landed all over Thomas. But still he went on. He presently found himself going down an old rickety track. Ahead, Thomas could see a thick wall of bushes. With a scrunch and a crunch, Thomas crashed through the bushes and came to a stop. Thomas looked around. After the racing and rattling, it was very quiet. Everything was very still. Thomas didn't know what to do. That's when he heard a voice. Thomas surveyed, but no one was in sight. He hardly dared to puff. Thomas stared once more, not seeing anyone. Very slowly, Thomas chuffed forward into the bushes. They crackled and crunched. Then Thomas gasped. His eyes popped wide with wonder. There, on the other side of the bushes, was a very old engine. It was broken and rusty. Thomas felt scared. He didn't dare speak. Then the old engine smiled at him. It was a small, frightened smile, but it made the old engine seem kind and gentle. This made Thomas feel less scared than before. The old engine smiled again. Thomas didn't have the strength to smile back. He was still scared. He didn't know whether to speak, toot for help, or race backwards as fast as he could chuff. Instead, Thomas didn't move. He couldn't take his eyes off this extraordinary engine. Thomas didn't know what to say next. He had never met an engine as old or as strange as Hero. Thomas was amazed. Thomas's eyes were wide with wonder. Thomas looked at his sad new friend. He felt sorry for Hero. Thomas was surprised. Thomas could see that his new friend, who was once master of the railway, was now old, alone, and scared. It was then that Thomas made a decision. Hero smiled the biggest smile he had smiled in a long while. Thomas beamed with pride. Later that morning, Thomas was at the Sodor Steamworks. He was having his brakes fixed. Thomas liked the steamworks. There was hustle and bustle, sparks and spanners. It was lively yet friendly. And there was Victor, who Thomas liked very much. Thomas had almost forgotten about the contest with Spencer. His boiler was bubbling with excitement over Hero. He wanted to tell Victor, but he knew that he couldn't. Other engines might hear, and then someone might tell the Fat Controller. Spencer was amazed. He wasn't expecting Thomas to be cheery. Spencer was shocked. And then Spencer slid away, sneering. Thomas laughed. He liked Victor. Behind Kevin, Thomas saw something very interesting. A wagon with an old piston cylinder on it. Thomas puffed away excited. That afternoon, Thomas was busy on his branch line. He wanted to finish his jobs as fast as he could puff. Percy was disappointed. Later, Thomas puffed back to the steamworks. He was pleased to see that it was very quiet. So, Thomas was coupled up to the flatbed, and he chuffed cheerfully along towards the track that led to Hero. Then he heard the clattering of wheels and pounding of pistons of a big engine coming up behind him. Thomas huffed and puffed as fast as he could towards a siding. His boiler bubbled as he slid to a stop. Tall trees hid Thomas from the main line. He could hear Spencer getting closer and closer as he rolled by. Then Spencer stopped and reversed, right on the other side of the trees to Thomas, who hardly dared to puff. Hero was very happy to see Thomas. Thomas's driver and fireman unloaded the old cylinder. Thomas smiled and steamed quickly away and puffed back towards Tidmouth. He chuffed round a bend. Then he gasped. That night, Thomas told the others all about his contest with Spencer. He was going to tell them about Hero, but the Fat Controller arrived. Now Thomas didn't dare tell his friends about Hero. The Fat Controller had spoken. No broken engines. The next day, Thomas did have a very busy morning, but he was not happy. He so wanted to be with Hero. Just then, Percy puffed up. Thomas looked at his best friend. He always told Percy everything. Percy was excited. He was always happy to help Thomas. Percy had puffed a long way on tracks he didn't know, looking for somewhere to hide his mail trucks. Thomas puffed happily towards Hero's hideout. He was so busy thinking about helping Hero that he didn't see Spencer steaming up behind him. Thomas raced away from Spencer and the summer house as quickly as his pistons would pump. Thomas didn't dare visit Hero until much later. Then, Thomas's driver and fireman opened their toolboxes and got to work. Soon, Hero's piston rods were in place. Thomas began puffing home as fast as he could. He was very late and had to puff past the summer house. Thomas didn't answer Spencer. He just chuffed quickly away. Spencer followed closely. Thomas was puffing fast, and then he saw Percy at the water tower. Percy looked very sad. Thomas felt sorry for his friend. Spencer had followed Thomas. He steamed to a stop alongside, and Spencer chuffed on. On the way to the steamworks, the two friends chatted cheerfully, mostly about Hero. The steamworks was still quiet. Victor was very surprised to see Thomas puff in with Percy. Then Thomas saw the old parts. He knew that Hero needed them. If he did, then he would have to tell Victor all about Hero. So Thomas told Victor about Hero. Victor was amazed. Thomas and Percy were very happy. That evening, Thomas puffed into Tidmouth's sheds. The Fat Controller was waiting. He looked very cross. Thomas knew whose fault that was. The Fat Controller's voice boomed around the sheds from top to bottom. Thomas's friends looked at him. They knew something strange was afoot. Thomas took in a deep, deep sigh. He needed his friend's help. As the stars sparkled above Tidmouth, Thomas told the others all about Hero. The engines had never heard such an amazing story. The next morning, Thomas was a really useful engine again. He huffed and he puffed, he shoved and he shunted, without stopping to ease his axles. Spencer watched Thomas's every move. He didn't even go to work at the Duke and Duchess's summer house, for he was too busy watching Thomas to even see Gordon go by pulling a flatbed of old engine parts for Hero. But Thomas saw Gordon, and Gordon saw Thomas, and they gave a smile to each other. Thomas worked hard all day. He was going to the Sodor Steamworks. Gordon steamed towards him. He was beaming from buffer to buffer. He was very happy to be helping Hero. At the steamworks, sparks flew and cogs turned. Percy was almost ready to leave. Percy and Thomas were happy, but not after seeing the Fat Controller looking cross. Victor could see that Thomas and Percy were worried. Thomas and Percy puffed up to Hero's hideout, where Percy would see the old engine for the first time. When he did, he couldn't help gasping. That made Thomas and Percy smile. On their way home, Thomas and Percy went by the summer house together. Their wheels whirred and their boilers bubbled. Neither of them saw Spencer, but he saw them, hiding in the shadows. Once they went past, he slipped out of the siding silently. In the morning, Thomas puffed off with Percy to find his mail trucks. Emily was busy doing Thomas's jobs on his branch line. Spencer watched her, but she took no notice of him. Spencer didn't like not knowing. He stared hard at Emily, so much so that he didn't see Thomas and Percy puff on the bridge above, nor did he see Edward with a flatbed of engine parts for Hero in tow. That evening, Thomas and Percy visited Hero again. Hero's boiler was finally finished, a colourful patchwork of parts. Thomas and Percy were happy. For the first time, Percy and Thomas heard Hero laugh. Loud, long, and happy. The next morning, Thomas and Percy searched the slate quarry for the mail trucks, but they couldn't find the trucks. What they did see was Spencer. Mavis was delighted. Thomas and Percy thought that was very funny indeed, but Spencer didn't. He scowled and he didn't see James puffing by with another flatbed of engine parts. Mavis proudly took Spencer under the slate hopper. He chuffed too quickly, then too slowly. Then he rolled back too far. Slate and dust flew down his funnel and bounced off his boiler. Later, Thomas and Percy were taking on coal. Emily chuffed by with yet another flatbed of old parts for Hero, feeling very excited. Then, Thomas saw Spencer. Percy gasped. Spencer was being pulled by Edward and shunted by Henry. Slate dust had blocked his funnel, meaning he had to go to the steamworks. Now Thomas and Percy could visit Hero safely. Hero began to look more and more like a really useful engine. Thomas and Percy puffed in. Then Victor saw that Spencer had closed his eyes because of the noise. Victor winked at Thomas. And Thomas chuffed carefully away from Spencer, and off to Hero he went. Thomas understood how hard it must be for Hero to be away from his home. He wanted to cheer him up. That night, Thomas puffed into Tidmouth sheds and once again had to face an angry Fat Controller. Dawn broke once more over the island, and Spencer was back to hunting. Spencer combed the tracks for clues. He searched behind bushes, steamed down sidings, until eventually he neared Hero's hideout. Suddenly, Spencer let out a long whistle. James and Toby heard Spencer. They pumped their pistons. Suddenly, James and Toby steamed out. Spencer had puffed too close to Hero. James whistled and Toby rang his bell in pursuit of the mighty Spencer down the main line and away from Hero. The three speeding engines approached a junction. Thomas chuffed toward Spencer. Spencer was blocked. Forwards and backwards. And he had suspiciously accumulated Percy's mail trucks. That afternoon, Hero was waiting for Thomas, feeling very excited. He was now in full steam. Then, there was the familiar sound of a piercing whistle. Both engines shivered. They knew what this meant. So, with a pounding puff and a heaving huff, Hero was on the tracks, following Thomas to steam away from Spencer. Hero steamed down the track, rattling and clattering. His pistons pumped and his boiler bubbled. Then there was trouble. Spencer snaked onto the track next to Thomas. Thomas's wheels whizzed forward like the wind. Hero chuffed as fast as he could, wanting to get away from Spencer. Spencer saw Hero and gasped. He saw an engine that was different and strange. Hero had started to clatter and clunk. His steam dome shook and his cylinders creaked. Hero started to worry. Without his water injector, Hero started to splutter. First his new lamp flew off, hitting Spencer. Now he was juddering and jittering. The old parts couldn't take the strain and fell off, clanging onto the tracks beneath. The faster Hero went, the more he fell apart. Then his dome fell off, followed by his cylinder caps. Hero knew that Spencer was right. The master of the railway was once more a heap of scrap. Hero had given up trying to go any further. Thomas had never felt worse. He and his friends had worked so hard, but he had let Hero down. Then Thomas heard another familiar whistle. It was Gordon and the express. Spencer was surprised. He saw Gordon thunder ahead with the express behind him. Spencer steamed after him, not seeing Thomas looking down another small, hidden siding. But poor Hero looked sadder than ever. Gordon raced towards Maythwaite ahead of Spencer. He was completely exhausted, what with the mail trucks rattling behind him. Before Spencer could speak, the doors of the express flung open to reveal the Duke and Duchess of Boxford stepping out of the express, looking cross. Spencer's pride was in pieces. The Duke and Duchess were delighted. Spencer wheeshed an outlet of steam. It was all so unfair. It was getting late as Thomas chuffed to see Hero. He had a sad look on his face. And Thomas steamed sadly away to Tidmouth. All the engines were worried about Hero's breakdown, and cross with Spencer. The other engines were quiet. They knew Thomas was right. But they couldn't stop worrying about Hero. They had come to know him as one of their own. They simply had to look after him. All the engines whistled. As a team, they were there for Hero. For the next few days, Thomas and Spencer worked on the summer house busily. Thomas wouldn't let Spencer out of his sight. Meanwhile, Thomas's friends all looked after Hero. He was never alone for long. He would laugh and tell stories about his homeland to a fascinated Gordon, Emily and Percy. He listened to Edward's wise tidbits. He sympathised with Henry's needs. He admired James's dazzling red coat and was in awe of Toby, the only steam tram he had ever met. The Duke and Duchess came to visit the nearly completed summer house. They were very pleased. Spencer beamed and told them all about it whilst Thomas slunk quietly away to see Hero. He was happy to see Thomas. Thomas could see Hero's solemn expression. Thomas chuffed back to the summer house, just in time to say goodbye to the Duke and Duchess. Spencer snarled at Thomas puffing away. So Spencer pumped his pistons once more and raced after Thomas. Thomas could hear Spencer's wheels whooshing and whirring behind him. Thomas and Spencer had the race of their lives. Thomas steamed over bridges and rushed through tunnels, sliding through junctions and snaked round bends. Spencer continued to chase after the little blue engine, but he couldn't overtake him. Thomas could see a junction ahead that turned off onto a sidetrack. He diverted, leaving Spencer to thunder on for a few yards before screeching to a halt, so that he could reverse back to the junction and then pursued Thomas once more along a much narrower track. They came to a bridge that went over marshland, but Thomas knew that it was a shortcut to Knapford. He puffed onwards, while Spencer huffed behind. He came closer and closer. Then it happened. The track near the end of the bridge was weak, and Spencer was too heavy. The track gave way and swallowed Spencer. The mighty engine slunk into the marshy waters below. Thomas stopped after what happened, but he couldn't do anything at the moment. And Thomas continued on towards Knapford. He was dirty and tired once he got to the platform, and the sun had begun to set. The Fat Controller was having supper with the Duke and Duchess. The station master telephoned him and asked the Fat Controller to come to Knapford right away. Thomas trembled on the rails beneath him. There was no turning back now. He knew he had to tell the Fat Controller everything about Hero. The Fat Controller listened. The Fat Controller stared at his engine. Thomas felt a lump in his boiler. He was now sure the Fat Controller would scrap Hero. Thomas was so happy he wanted to whistle louder than ever. The next day, Thomas and Percy brought Hero to the Sodor Steamworks. The Fat Controller was waiting. A few days later, all the engines went to see Hero. He puffed forward slowly and grandly. The engines gaped. Hero looked as good as new, without a patch of rust in sight. Hero shunted Rocky into position. and Workman connected his hook to Spencer, very slowly and carefully. Spencer was lifted back onto the track, and then with a mighty heave, Hero pulled Rocky and Spencer towards the steamworks. When Spencer was fixed, he joined Hero and Thomas. Together the 3 engines worked on the summer house, huffing and puffing their hardest. Just then, the Duke and Duchess arrived for their holiday. They were delighted. That night, Thomas and Hero were resting. Their axles ached and their wheels were weary. Thomas saw that Hero was sad, and before you could say master of the railway, Thomas had chuffed off. A few days later, all of the engines were at Brendam Docks. They were very excited. All the engines whistled, followed by a long, low and strong whistle. It was Hero. He chuffed slowly up the track and stopped by Thomas and Percy.